settle into the sleepy mine channel. Today we will explore the lost Egyptian city of Thonis Heracleion, a place where an entire settlement once stood at the edge of the Nile Delta before quietly disappearing beneath the sea. Beneath the shallow waters of the Mediterranean Sea, near where the Nile spreads into a wide network of channels, the remains of this ancient city rest under layers of sand and sediment. Massive statues lie on their sides, temple walls extend across the seabed, and fragments of everyday life remain preserved in positions that suggest the moment everything changed. The stillness of the underwater landscape gives the impression that the city was not gradually abandoned, but instead lost in a way that left its structure largely intact beneath the surface. For centuries, Thonis Heracleion existed only in written records, described in ancient Egyptian and Greek texts as an important gateway into Egypt. Ships arriving from across the Mediterranean would first pass through this port before continuing inland along the Nile. It was a place where goods were inspected, travelers were recorded, and trade was carefully controlled. Over time, as the physical city disappeared, its memory remained uncertain, with some historians questioning whether it had ever truly existed. If you like videos like these, feel free to like and subscribe. More videos are posted weekly. The rediscovery of Thonis Heracleion revealed that it had once been one of the most significant port cities of the ancient world. Archaeologists uncovered temples, statues, and ships resting beneath the seabed, confirming that the city described in historical texts was not a myth, but a real and complex settlement that had played a central role in Egyptian trade and culture. The preservation of these structures allows for a detailed view into how the city once functioned, offering insight into both its design and its daily life. The location of the city was shaped by the geography of the Nile Delta, where fresh water from the river meets the salt water of the Mediterranean Sea. This region is formed by layers of sediment carried downstream over thousands of years, creating soft ground that shifts under pressure. While this environment provided access to major trade routes, it also introduced long-term challenges for building stable structures. The balance between opportunity and instability would become a defining feature of the city. Thonis Heracleion served as a controlled entry point into Egypt, where officials regulated the movement of goods and people. Ships arriving from distant regions were required to stop at the port, where cargo was inspected and taxed before being allowed to travel further inland. This system ensured that trade remained organized and beneficial to the Egyptian state, while also establishing the city as a central hub within a wider network of commerce. The city was known by different names depending on cultural perspective. Egyptian texts referred to it as Thonis, while Greek sources called it Heracleion, reflecting the presence of foreign traders and the blending of cultural influences. This dual identity highlights the role of the city as a meeting point between different worlds, where languages, customs, and traditions interacted through trade and daily life. As the city grew, it expanded across a landscape shaped by water. Built on a series of islands and connected by canals, Thonis Heracleion became a place where waterways functioned as streets and boats served as a primary form of transport. Goods moved through the city along these channels, linking markets, storage areas, and religious sites in a network that was closely integrated with its environment. Despite its importance, the city gradually disappeared from the physical world. Without visible remains above water, its exact location became uncertain, and its existence was debated. The absence of clear evidence led to questions about whether the city described in ancient texts could be identified with any known location. Over time, the idea of Thonis Heracleion shifted from recorded history towards something closer to legend. The rediscovery of the site changed this understanding completely. Using modern technology, archaeologists were able to detect structures beneath the seabed, revealing the outlines of a city that had been hidden for centuries. The findings confirmed that the port described in ancient records had once stood at the edge of the Nile Delta, connecting Egypt to the wider world through trade and movement. The condition of the site suggests that the city did not simply fade away through gradual abandonment. Instead, the patterns observed beneath the water indicate a more sudden transformation, where structures remained largely in place as the land itself changed. This distinction is important as it points to environmental factors rather than human decisions as the primary cause of its disappearance. Looking at the remains of Thonis Heracleion, it becomes clear that its story is shaped by both human activity and natural processes. The design of the city reflects its role as a major port, while its location reveals the risks associated with building in a dynamic coastal environment. These two elements are closely connected, forming the foundation for understanding how the city once existed and how it eventually became part of the seabed. The presence of large statues, temple structures, and everyday objects beneath the water provides a rare opportunity to observe a city that has been preserved in an unusual way. Unlike sites that have been rebuilt or heavily altered over time, Thonis Heracleion offers a view into a moment where change occurred and then settled into stillness. This preservation allows for careful observation, where details can be studied within the context of the environment that surrounds them. As this exploration continues, the focus remains on understanding how the city functioned, how it was connected to the wider world, and how it came to be submerged beneath the sea. Each element contributes to a broader picture where the interaction between land, water, and human activity defines the story of Thonis Heracleion. Through this perspective, the city is not only seen as a lost place, but as part of an ongoing process where environments shift and settlements adapt or disappear. The remains beneath the water reflect this process, offering insight into how a once thriving port became part of the underwater landscape that exists today. The location of Thonis Heracleion was not chosen by chance, but shaped by the unique geography of the Nile Delta, where the river divides into multiple channels before meeting the Mediterranean Sea. This region forms a broad, low-lying landscape built from layers of sediment carried downstream over long periods. These deposits create fertile land that supports growth and settlement, while also producing ground that is soft, saturated, and constantly shifting beneath the surface. The combination of opportunity and instability defines the environment in which the city developed. The Nile Delta is defined by its constant relationship with water. Fresh water flows outward through branching channels, while salt water from the Mediterranean moves inward along the coastline. This interaction creates a zone where movement is continuous, with currents, tides, and seasonal flooding all contributing to gradual changes in the landscape. Over time, These forces reshape the region, altering shorelines, redistributing sediment, and influencing how land and water interact. Within this setting, Thonis Heracleion developed at a point where river and sea met, creating a natural gateway into Egypt. Ships traveling from across the Mediterranean would approach the delta and pass through its waterways before continuing inland along the Nile. The city's position allowed it to control this movement, making it a strategic location for managing trade, monitoring access, and regulating the flow of goods into the country. The ground beneath the city was formed from fine sediment deposited by the Nile over thousands of years. While this material created a stable surface in the short term, it remained sensitive to pressure and water saturation. Buildings constructed on this type of ground required careful balance, as the weight of structures could influence how the soil responded beneath them. This meant that stability was never absolute, but dependent on conditions that could shift gradually over time. Water saturation played a key role in shaping how the ground behaved. The presence of groundwater within the sediment meant that the soil could act differently depending on pressure and moisture levels. When conditions were stable, it could support buildings and infrastructure. When disturbed, it could lose cohesion and begin to shift more easily. This characteristic made the environment both usable and unpredictable, requiring constant adaptation. The network of waterways surrounding Thonis Heracleion shaped both its layout and its daily function. Natural channels of the Nile were combined with man-made canals, forming a system that allowed movement throughout the city by boat. These waterways served as routes for transporting goods, connecting different areas, and supporting trade activity across the settlement. In many ways, water functioned as the primary means of movement rather than land. The integration of land and water meant that the city was closely tied to its environment. Buildings were positioned alongside canals, and docks were constructed to receive ships arriving from distant regions. Storage areas, markets, and administrative spaces were placed near these waterways, allowing goods to move efficiently through the city. This layout reflected a design that adapted to the presence of water rather than resisting it. Seasonal changes added another layer to this environment. The Nile's annual flooding cycle brought additional sediment into the delta, gradually building up land while also increasing water saturation. These floods were predictable but powerful, influencing how the ground responded to pressure and how structures needed to be maintained. Over time, the accumulation of sediment and water contributed to subtle changes in the landscape. The proximity to the Mediterranean Sea introduced further complexity. Coastal conditions, including tides and occasional storms, could alter water levels and affect the stability of the shoreline. These variations added another dimension to the already dynamic environment, where both river and sea influenced the balance of the land. Even small changes in sea level could have noticeable effects in such a low-lying region. Despite these challenges, the location offered clear advantages. The connection between river and sea allowed direct access to major trade routes, linking Egypt with regions across the Mediterranean. This access supported the growth of Thonis Heracleion as a major port, where goods, people, and cultural influences could move between different parts of the ancient world. The city's importance was closely tied to this position. The environment also influenced how structures were built. Foundations needed to distribute weight carefully across the soft ground, reducing the risk of sinking or shifting. Materials and construction methods were adapted to suit these conditions, creating buildings that could function within a landscape that was never completely stable. This required ongoing attention to how structures interacted with the ground beneath them. At the same time, the presence of water required continuous maintenance. Canals needed to be kept clear to allow movement, and docks had to be maintained to support incoming ships. Structures near waterways were exposed to moisture and gradual erosion, requiring regular attention to remain functional. This ongoing interaction between environment and infrastructure shaped the daily operation of the city. The relationship between natural processes and human activity defined the setting of Thonis Heracleion. The same conditions that made the location valuable for trade also introduced risks that were not immediately visible. Over long periods, small changes in water levels, sediment movement, and soil stability could accumulate, gradually altering the balance that supported the city. Understanding this environment is essential for interpreting what is observed on the seabed today. The patterns of structures and the condition of artifacts are influenced by the processes that shaped the land before it became submerged. Each feature reflects both its original placement and the changes that have occurred over time. The Nile Delta remains a dynamic landscape, where the interaction between river and sea continues to shape the region. Observing these processes in the present provides insight into how similar forces may have acted in the past. This connection helps explain how a city built in such a setting could eventually become part of the underwater environment. Through this perspective, the setting of Thonis Heracleion is understood not as a fixed location, but as part of a continuous process of change. The movement of water, the shifting of sediment, and the response of the ground all contribute to the conditions that define the city. These factors form the foundation for understanding how the city developed, functioned, and ultimately became submerged beneath the sea. The early development of Thonis Heracleion was closely connected to the increasing importance of trade in ancient Egypt, particularly during periods when interaction with other regions became more frequent and more organized. As movement across the Mediterranean expanded, Egypt required controlled entry points where goods, travelers, and information could be managed before entering the interior of the country. The location at the mouth of the Nile provided an ideal setting for this function, creating a natural point where maritime routes met inland waterways. In its earliest form, the settlement likely began as a small but strategic trading outpost, positioned along one of the navigable channels of the Nile Delta. Ships traveling from the Mediterranean would approach the coastline and enter the branching waterways, moving from open sea into a network of river channels that led deeper into Egypt. This transition created a natural checkpoint where movement slowed and could be observed, allowing the settlement to develop as a place of control rather than simple passage. Officials stationed at this early port were responsible for regulating activity in a structured way. Incoming ships were required to stop, where cargo could be inspected, recorded, and taxed according to established systems. This ensured that goods entering Egypt were accounted for, while also generating revenue that supported the broader economy. The presence of these administrative functions gave the settlement importance beyond its size, as it became part of a wider system of economic control. As trade increased, the need for infrastructure grew alongside it. storage areas were established near docking points, allowing goods to be held temporarily before being transported inland along the Nile. These spaces were organized to handle different types of cargo, including agricultural products, raw materials, and crafted goods. The ability to store and redistribute goods efficiently contributed to the expansion of the settlement. Markets began to form around these storage areas, creating places where merchants could exchange goods and services. These markets were not limited to local trade, but connected directly to wider networks, linking the settlement to regions across the Mediterranean. The movement of goods through the port created a constant flow of activity, where arrival and departure shaped the rhythm of daily life. The presence of foreign merchants played a significant role in shaping the early character of the city. Traders from regions such as Greece and the Near East brought goods, technologies, and cultural practices that interacted with Egyptian traditions. This exchange created a diverse environment where different languages, customs, and systems of trade coexisted, contributing to the gradual complexity of the settlement. Over time, the settlement developed a more defined structure, with areas dedicated to specific functions. Administrative spaces were established near docking points, allowing officials to oversee trade efficiently. Storage areas expanded, and pathways and canals were organized to support the movement of goods between different parts of the settlement. This organization reflects the transition from a simple outpost to a more complex urban environment. The dual identity of the city emerged during this period of growth. Egyptian sources referred to the settlement as Thonis, while Greek traders called it Heracleion, linking the location to their own cultural references. This difference in naming highlights the role of the city as a point of connection between cultures, where identity was shaped through interaction rather than defined by a single perspective. Religious structures were also introduced as the settlement expanded, reflecting the importance of spiritual life within Egyptian society. Temples dedicated to major deities were constructed near key areas of activity, linking trade with religious practice. These structures served both practical and symbolic roles, reinforcing the authority of the city, while also providing spaces for ritual and ceremony. The physical layout of the settlement was shaped by its integration with water. Built across small islands and connected by canals, the city developed in a way that allowed movement primarily by boat. These waterways functioned as routes for transporting goods and people, linking docks, markets, and storage areas in a system that was adapted to the environment. This approach allowed the settlement to operate efficiently despite the challenges of its location. As activity increased, the settlement expanded outward, occupying more space within the delta. Additional canals were constructed to improve movement, and docks were extended to accommodate larger ships. These changes required coordination and planning, reflecting the growing complexity of the city and its role within a wider network of trade. The environment continued to influence how this expansion took place. The soft ground required careful placement of structures, while the presence of water shaped how buildings were arranged. Each stage of growth involved adapting to these conditions, creating a settlement that remained closely connected to its surroundings. The increasing importance of the port also led to the development of a structured social environment. Residents included officials responsible for administration, merchants engaged in trade, and workers involved in transport, construction, and maintenance. Daily life was shaped by the constant movement of goods and the arrival of ships, creating a setting where activity was both organized and continuous. The early origins of Thonis Heracleion therefore represent a process of gradual transformation. What began as a strategic location developed into a central hub of trade and administration, driven by the need to manage increasing interaction between Egypt and the wider world. This growth was shaped by both opportunity and environmental constraint, creating a city that functioned within a dynamic and changing landscape. Understanding this early development provides a foundation for examining how the city continued to expand and evolve. The systems established during this period, including trade regulation, infrastructure development, and cultural exchange, would shape the role of Thonis Heracleion as it grew into one of the most important port cities in ancient Egypt. As Thonis Heracleion continued to develop, its growth was shaped not only by increasing trade, but by the unique way in which the city expanded across a landscape defined by water. Unlike settlements built on continuous land, the city formed across a series of small islands and raised sections of ground within the Nile Delta. These areas were connected by natural channels and man-made canals, creating a network where movement depended on water as much as, or more than, land. The expansion of the city followed the paths of these waterways. Instead of spreading outward in a uniform pattern, development occurred along channels that allowed access for boats carrying goods and materials. This created a layout where different parts of the city were linked through flowing routes rather than fixed roads. The arrangement reflected the environment, where water provided the most efficient means of connection. As trade activity increased, the demand for space grew alongside it. New areas were developed to support storage, markets, and docking facilities, each positioned in relation to the waterways that sustained them. Goods arriving from distant regions could be unloaded directly onto docks and moved through canals to designated storage areas. This system reduced the need for overland transport and allowed for more efficient handling of cargo. The construction of canals played a central role in this expansion. Some channels were natural extensions of the Nile's branching system, while others were modified or created to improve movement within the city. These canals allowed for controlled circulation, ensuring that goods could move smoothly between different areas without congestion. Maintaining these waterways required ongoing effort, as sediment buildup could block routes and disrupt the flow of trade. Bridges were constructed to connect sections of land across canals, allowing movement between areas that could not be reached directly by boat. These crossings provided access for people moving between residential, commercial, and administrative zones. The presence of bridges highlights how the city balanced water-based transport with limited land movement, creating a hybrid system adapted to its environment. Buildings were arranged in relation to these waterways, with many structures positioned along canal edges. This placement allowed direct access to transport routes, making it easier to move goods in and out of storage areas and marketplaces. The orientation of buildings reflects a design that prioritized connection to water, reinforcing the importance of canals within the city's structure. Residential areas developed alongside commercial zones, creating a landscape where daily life was closely linked to trade activity. Homes were built on stable sections of land, often near waterways that provided access to markets and workplaces. This arrangement meant that movement through the city was integrated into everyday routines, with boats serving as a common means of transport. The expansion of Thonis Heracleion also required coordination at a larger scale. As new areas were developed, They needed to be connected to existing systems in a way that maintained efficiency. This involved planning the placement of canals, docks, and storage areas to ensure that movement remained organized. The growth of the city was therefore not random, but guided by practical considerations related to trade and environment. The increasing size of the port allowed it to accommodate larger numbers of ships, reinforcing its role as a major gateway into Egypt. Docks were extended and reinforced to support vessels arriving from across the Mediterranean, while designated areas were established for loading and unloading cargo. These developments contributed to the city's ability to handle high volumes of trade. At the same time, the environment continued to influence how expansion could occur. The soft ground required careful management, as building too heavily in one area could lead to instability. This meant that development had to be distributed across multiple sections, spreading weight and reducing pressure on the underlying sediment. The structure of the city reflects this need to balance growth with environmental limitations. The relationship between land and water also shaped how space was used. Areas that were more stable could support larger structures, such as temples and administrative buildings, while other sections were used for lighter construction or remained open to allow for movement. This variation created a landscape with different zones, each adapted to its specific conditions. As the city expanded, its identity as a water-based settlement became more defined. Movement through canals, the positioning of buildings along waterways, and the integration of transport systems all contributed to a way of life that depended on the presence of water. This identity distinguished Thonis Heracleion from inland cities, where land-based movement played a greater role. The growth of the city also strengthened its economic position. The ability to move goods efficiently through its waterways made it an effective center for trade, attracting merchants from different regions. This increased activity contributed to further expansion as new infrastructure was developed to support the growing demands of commerce. Despite its success, the patterns of expansion reveal the underlying challenges of the environment. The reliance on canals and the distribution of structures across islands reflect a need to adapt continuously to shifting conditions. These adaptations allowed the city to function effectively, but they also highlight the balance that needed to be maintained. Understanding this phase of growth provides insight into how Thonis Heracleion reached its peak as a major port city. The expansion across waterways, the development of infrastructure, and the integration of land and water systems all contributed to its success. At the same time, these elements set the stage for the pressures that would later affect the stability of the city. Through this perspective, the expansion of Thonis Heracleion can be seen as both a response to opportunity and an adaptation to constraint. The city grew by working within the conditions of the Nile Delta, creating a network that supported trade while remaining closely tied to its environment. This relationship between growth and environment remains central to understanding its development and its eventual transformation. At its height, Thonis Heracleion became one of the most important port cities in ancient Egypt, serving as a central point where the movement of goods and people between the Mediterranean and the Nile could be controlled with precision. Its position at the edge of the delta allowed it to function as both a gateway and a filter, where incoming trade was not simply received, but carefully organized before continuing inland. This role gave the city a level of importance that extended beyond its physical size, placing it at the center of a wider network of economic and administrative activity. Merchant ships from across the Mediterranean followed established routes that brought them directly to the Nile Delta, where Thonis Heracleion acted as their first point of entry. These ships carried a wide range of goods, including raw materials, crafted items, and resources that were exchanged between regions. The arrival of each vessel added to the activity of the port, creating a steady and predictable flow that reinforced the city's role within the larger system of trade. When ships approached the port, they followed established routes that guided them towards specific entry channels within the Nile Delta. These routes were shaped by both natural waterways and managed navigation paths, allowing vessels to move safely from open sea into the more complex network of channels. As ships entered the port, their movement slowed, creating a controlled environment where officials could observe and direct traffic toward designated docking areas. Docking was organized based on factors such as the size of the vessel, the type of cargo it carried, and its origin. Larger ships were directed to areas with sufficient depth and space, while smaller vessels could be guided into narrower channels. This level of organization reduced congestion and allowed multiple ships to be processed at the same time without disrupting the overall flow of activity within the port. Once docked, the process of unloading began in a coordinated sequence. Workers transferred goods from ships to receiving areas located along the docks, where items could be sorted and prepared for inspection. This stage required careful handling, as cargo needed to remain intact while being moved quickly enough to keep the system running smoothly. The coordination between workers ensured that unloading remained continuous rather than delayed. The inspection and recording of goods formed a central part of the trade system. Officials documented the type, quantity, and origin of each item, creating a detailed record that supported both taxation and regulation. This change allowed the city to maintain control over what entered Egypt, ensuring that trade remained organized and predictable. The accuracy of these records was essential, as it influenced both economic planning and administrative oversight. Taxation was applied based on the recorded information, linking the movement of goods directly to the revenue of the Egyptian state. This system was structured to reflect the value and nature of the cargo, ensuring that contributions were consistent and fair within the framework of the time. The ability to collect revenue efficiently reinforced the importance of the port within the broader economy. After inspection, goods were directed either towards storage facilities or prepared for immediate transport inland. Storage areas were positioned close to the docks, allowing goods to be secured quickly before being redistributed. These facilities were organized to handle different types of cargo, with spaces designated for specific materials to ensure efficient retrieval when needed. For goods moving inland, transportation relied on the waterways of the Nile, which provided a direct connection to cities further south. Boats carried cargo through these channels, linking Thonis Heracleion to a network that extended deep into Egypt. This system allowed goods to move with relative speed and consistency, maintaining the connection between coastal trade and inland distribution. The flow of goods also operated in the opposite direction, with Egyptian products prepared for export through the same system. Grain, papyrus, and other materials were transported to the port, where they were processed and loaded onto ships bound for other regions. This two-way movement created a balanced system where imports and exports were integrated into a single continuous process. Timing played an important role in maintaining this balance. Trade activity was influenced by seasonal patterns, including weather conditions and river levels, which affected navigation. The city adapted to these patterns by organizing labor and resources to match periods of increased or reduced activity, ensuring that the system remained stable throughout the year. Labor within the city was structured to support this continuous movement. Workers were assigned to specific roles, including unloading cargo, recording goods, managing storage, and transporting items through canals. Each role was part of a larger system, where coordination ensured that no stage of the process became disconnected from the others. Communication between different parts of the city supported this coordination. Information about arriving ships, cargo types, and storage capacity needed to be shared quickly, allowing each stage of the process to respond effectively. This exchange of information helped maintain the steady flow that defined the operation of the port. The physical design of the city reinforced this system. Canals connected docks, storage areas, and markets, creating direct routes for transporting goods. This reduced the need for repeated handling and allowed cargo to move efficiently from one stage to the next. The layout of the city therefore supported the movement of goods as part of an integrated network. Foreign merchants added complexity to this system, bringing goods that required careful integration into existing processes. The ability of the port to handle a wide range of items reflects the flexibility of its organization, where different types of cargo could be managed without disrupting the overall flow. The success of this system depended on maintaining a balance between efficiency and control. Goods needed to move quickly enough to support trade, while also being regulated to ensure stability. This balance allowed Thonis Heracleion to function as a reliable center of exchange, where movement was both continuous and structured. Understanding this system provides insight into how the city operated at its peak. The coordinated movement of goods, the organization of labor, and the integration of waterways all contributed to a system that supported large-scale trade. This structure defined the city's role within the wider network of the ancient world, shaping both its success and the conditions that would later influence its transformation. As Thonis Heracleion continued to grow as a center of trade and administration, it also developed a strong religious presence that was closely connected to its daily activity. In ancient Egypt, religion was not separate from economic or social life, but integrated into the structure of cities and the actions of the people who lived within them. The presence of temples within the port reflects this connection, where spiritual practices existed alongside the movement of goods and the management of trade. The city was home to major temples dedicated to Egyptian deities, with particular importance given to Amun, a figure associated with creation, power, and kingship. These temples were positioned in areas that were both accessible and central to activity, allowing them to serve as focal points within the city. Their placement ensured that religious life remained visible and connected to the functioning of the port. The construction of these temples required significant resources, reflecting the wealth generated by the city's role in trade. Large stone blocks were transported and assembled to create structures that were both durable and visually imposing. The scale of these buildings reinforced their importance, establishing them as central features within the landscape of Thonis Heracleion. Within the temples, rituals were performed regularly, following established traditions that linked the city to the broader religious practices of Egypt. These ceremonies were carried out by priests who were responsible for maintaining the connection between the people and the deities. The repetition of these rituals created a sense of continuity, reinforcing the role of religion within the daily life of the city. Offerings formed an important part of these practices. Goods such as food, crafted items, and valuable materials were presented within the temples as acts of devotion. These offerings reflected both religious belief and the economic activity of the port, as many of the items used in rituals were connected to the flow of trade passing through the city. The relationship between religion and trade was not indirect, but closely linked. Merchants arriving at the port often participated in rituals, seeking protection for their journeys and success in their exchanges. This connection created a system where economic activity was supported by spiritual practices, reinforcing the importance of both within the city. The presence of foreign merchants introduced additional cultural elements into the religious environment. Traders from regions such as Greece brought their own beliefs and traditions, which interacted with Egyptian practices. This interaction did not replace existing systems, but added layers of complexity to the religious life of the city, reflecting its role as a point of cultural exchange. The temples also served administrative and symbolic functions. Their presence reinforced authority, linking the city's role in trade with the broader structure of Egyptian society. Religious spaces were not only places of worship, but also locations where decisions and declarations could be made, reflecting their importance within the social framework. The design of the temples reflected both practical and symbolic considerations. Structures were built to withstand environmental conditions, while also incorporating elements that represented religious meaning. Columns, statues, and carvings were arranged to create spaces that guided movement and focused attention within the temple environment. Large statues were placed within and around these temples, representing deities and figures associated with religious practice. These statues were carved from stone and positioned in ways that emphasized their importance. Their presence added to the visual identity of the city, linking its physical structure with its spiritual life. The integration of temples into the layout of Thonis Heracleion reflects how religion was woven into the design of the city. Rather than being isolated, these structures were connected to areas of trade and daily activity, allowing religious practices to remain part of the overall flow of life within the settlement. The maintenance of these temples required ongoing effort, as rituals needed to be performed regularly and structures had to be preserved. This responsibility was carried out by individuals who were part of the religious system, ensuring that the connection between the city and its deities remained active. The presence of these religious spaces contributed to the identity of Thonis Heracleion as more than a commercial center. While trade defined its economic role, the integration of temples and rituals added a layer of meaning that connected the city to the broader cultural and spiritual traditions of Egypt. The relationship between religion and daily life created a balanced system where practical activity and belief existed together. The movement of goods, the arrival of ships, and the performance of rituals were all part of a continuous process that defined the character of the city. Understanding the religious significance of Thonis Heracleion provides insight into how the city functioned beyond its role in trade. The presence of temples, the performance of rituals, and the connection between belief and activity all contribute to a more complete picture of life within the settlement. Through this perspective, the city can be seen as a place where economic, social, and spiritual elements were closely connected. The temples of Thonis Heracleion reflect this integration, showing how religion shaped the experience of those who lived and worked within the port. This combination of trade and religious practice defined the city during its period of growth, creating a setting where movement and meaning existed together. The structures that remain beneath the water continue to reflect this connection, offering insight into a system where belief and activity were part of the same environment. As Thonis Heracleion developed into a major port city, its role as a meeting point between different regions brought with it a steady exchange of cultures. The movement of goods through the port was accompanied by the movement of people, ideas, and practices, creating an environment where different traditions existed alongside one another. This interaction shaped the character of the city, giving it a distinct identity that reflected both Egyptian foundations and foreign influence. Merchants arriving from across the Mediterranean brought more than cargo. They carried languages, customs, and ways of thinking that became part of the daily experience within the city. Greek traders in particular were a strong presence in Thonis Heracleion as trade routes between Greece and Egypt became more established. Their continued interaction with local populations contributed to a gradual blending of cultural elements. This exchange was not a sudden change, but a process that developed over time. Egyptian traditions remained central to the structure of the city, including its religious practices, administrative systems, and social organization. At the same time, foreign influences were introduced through repeated contact, creating a layered environment where different cultural elements coexisted without replacing one another. Language was one of the most visible aspects of this interaction. Egyptian and Greek languages were both present within the city, used in trade, communication, and record-keeping. This created a setting where individuals needed to navigate multiple systems of expression, reflecting the diverse nature of the population. The use of different languages highlights the role of the city as a point of connection between regions. Trade itself encouraged cultural exchange by bringing people into regular contact. Negotiations, agreements, and daily transactions required interaction between individuals from different backgrounds. Through these interactions, knowledge and practices were shared, influencing how trade was conducted and how relationships were formed. Religious practices also reflected this blending of cultures. While Egyptian deities and rituals remained dominant, Greek influences appeared through the presence of foreign merchants who brought their own beliefs. These beliefs interacted with existing traditions, creating a religious environment that was shaped by both continuity and adaptation. The coexistence of different practices illustrates how the city accommodated diversity within its structure. Art and material culture provide further evidence of this exchange. Objects found within the site show influences from multiple regions, including variations in design, style, and technique. These objects reflect the movement of ideas as well as goods, demonstrating how cultural elements were incorporated into daily life within the city. The layout and function of the city also supported this interaction. Markets and gathering spaces brought people together, creating opportunities for exchange beyond formal trade. These spaces allowed for the sharing of information, stories, and experiences, contributing to the cultural richness of the settlement. The presence of foreign communities within Thonis Heracleion added to this complexity. Merchants who remained in the city for extended periods formed connections with local populations, contributing to a more integrated environment. These relationships influenced both economic and social structures, shaping how the city functioned as a whole. At the same time, the integration of cultures required a level of organization that allowed differences to coexist without disrupting the stability of the city. Administrative systems remained grounded in Egyptian practices, providing a consistent framework that supported the diverse population. This balance allowed the city to function effectively while accommodating multiple influences. The exchange of ideas extended beyond trade and religion into areas such as technology and craftsmanship. Techniques introduced by foreign merchants could be adapted and incorporated into local practices, contributing to the development of new methods and approaches. This exchange supported innovation while maintaining continuity within the city's traditions. The identity of Thonis Heracleion was therefore shaped by both its role as an Egyptian city and its position within a wider network of exchange. It was not defined by a single culture, but by the interaction between multiple influences that existed together within the same environment. This combination created a dynamic setting where change occurred gradually through repeated contact. The presence of these cultural interactions contributed to the city's importance within the ancient world. As a place where different regions connected, it facilitated not only the movement of goods, but also the exchange of knowledge and practices. This role reinforced its position as a central point within a network that extended across the Mediterranean. Understanding this cultural exchange provides insight into how Thonis Heracleion functioned beyond its economic role. The blending of traditions, the presence of multiple languages, and the interaction between different communities all contribute to a more complete picture of life within the city. Through this perspective, the city can be seen as a place where connection defined its character. The exchange of goods, ideas, and beliefs created a layered environment that reflected the wider world beyond its boundaries. This environment shaped both the experience of those who lived there and the role of the city within the broader system of trade and interaction. The remains of Thonis Heracleion continue to reflect this complexity. Objects, structures, and patterns found beneath the water provide evidence of a city that was shaped by multiple influences, each contributing to its identity. These elements offer insight into how cultural exchange operated within the port, connecting it to regions far beyond its immediate location. Daily life in Thonis Heracleion was shaped by the constant movement of water, goods, and people, creating a rhythm that was both steady and closely connected to the function of the city. Unlike inland settlements where activity centered around land-based routes, life here unfolded along canals, docks, and waterways that served as the primary paths of movement. The presence of trade influenced nearly every aspect of daily experience, linking routine activity to the broader system of exchange. For many residents, The day began with activity near the waterways, where boats arrived carrying goods from distant regions or from inland areas along the Nile. Workers involved in unloading cargo moved items from ships to receiving areas, following processes that were structured and continuous. This activity formed one of the most visible aspects of life in the city, where movement and coordination were constant. Markets developed alongside these areas of activity, creating spaces where goods could be exchanged directly. Merchants displayed items brought from different regions, while local traders offered goods produced within Egypt. These markets were not isolated locations, but connected to the flow of trade, where the arrival of new cargo influenced what was available and how it was exchanged. Transportation within the city relied heavily on boats, which moved through canals connecting different areas. Residents used these waterways to travel between homes, markets, and workplaces, making water-based movement part of everyday life. This system allowed the city to function efficiently, despite the fragmented nature of its layout across islands and channels. Homes were built on sections of land that provided relative stability, often positioned near canals to allow easy access to transportation routes. The design of these residential areas reflected the need to balance proximity to activity with the conditions of the environment. Living close to water offered convenience, but also required adaptation to changing conditions. Fishing played an important role in supporting daily life, providing both food and a source of economic activity. The surrounding waterways offered access to fish and other resources, which were used locally or traded within the markets. This connection to the environment reinforced the relationship between the city and its natural setting. Craftsmanship and labor were also part of daily activity, with individuals involved in producing goods that supported trade and local use. Tools, containers, and other items were created within the city, contributing to the flow of materials through its systems. These activities added to the complexity of the economy, linking production with exchange. Administrative work formed another layer of daily life, particularly for those responsible for managing trade. Officials recorded goods, monitored transactions, and ensured that processes were followed correctly. Their presence maintained the structure of the system, allowing activity to continue without disruption. Religious practices were integrated into daily routines, with individuals visiting temples to participate in rituals or make offerings. These activities were not separate from other aspects of life, but connected to the flow of work and trade. The presence of temples within the city ensured that spiritual practices remained part of everyday experience. The relationship between different groups of people added to the character of the city. Merchants, workers, officials, and residents all contributed to the activity within Thonis Heracleion, creating a setting where roles were interconnected. The presence of foreign traders introduced additional diversity, influencing how people communicated and interacted. The sound and movement of the city reflected its function as a port, boats moving through canals, goods being transferred between locations, and conversations between traders all contributed to an environment defined by activity. This continuous motion created a rhythm that shaped how time was experienced within the city. At the same time, moments of stillness existed within this activity. Residential areas provided spaces where daily routines continued at a slower pace, allowing for rest and personal life within a setting otherwise defined by movement. These quieter spaces balance the intensity of the port, creating a more complete environment. The environment influenced daily life in subtle ways. Changes in water levels, the movement of sediment, and seasonal patterns all affected how people interacted with their surroundings. Residents adapted to these conditions, developing routines that worked within the shifting landscape of the delta. The integration of these elements created a way of life that was closely tied to both trade and environment. Daily activity was not separate from the larger systems of the city, but part of a continuous process where individual actions contributed to the overall function of the port. Understanding daily life in Thonis Heracleion provides insight into how the city operated beyond its economic systems. The routines of residents, the movement of goods, and the interaction between different groups all reflect a setting where activity and environment were closely connected. Through this perspective, the city can be seen as a place where everyday experience was shaped by the same forces that defined its larger role. The presence of water, the flow of trade, and the interaction between people created a dynamic environment that influenced how life was lived within the settlement. The remains beneath the water continue to reflect these patterns, offering a view into a city where daily life was structured by movement, connection, and adaptation. These details provide a deeper understanding of how Thonis Heracleion functioned as both a place of work and a place of living. The infrastructure of Thonis Heracleion was shaped by the need to build and maintain a functioning city within an environment defined by water and unstable ground. Every structure, from docks to temples, required careful planning to ensure that it could exist within conditions that were constantly changing. The engineering of the city was therefore not only about construction, but about adaptation, where each element needed to work with the environment rather than against it. One of the most important aspects of this infrastructure was the development of docks capable of receiving ships arriving from the Mediterranean. These docks had to be positioned in areas with sufficient depth to allow vessels to approach safely, while also providing stable ground for unloading cargo. The construction of these areas required an understanding of both water movement and soil conditions, ensuring that they could support repeated use without failure. The foundations of buildings presented another challenge. The ground beneath the city was composed of soft sediment that could shift under pressure, making it difficult to support heavy structures. To address this, builders distributed weight across wider areas, reducing the stress placed on any single point. This approach allowed structures to remain stable under normal conditions, even if the ground beneath them was not fully solid. Materials used in construction were selected based on their ability to function within this environment. Stone provided durability and resistance to water, while wood could be used for structures that required flexibility. The combination of these materials allowed builders to create systems that balanced strength with adaptability, ensuring that infrastructure could respond to changing conditions. Canals formed a central part of the city's engineering, acting as both transport routes and structural features that defined the layout of the settlement. These waterways needed to be maintained regularly to prevent the buildup of sediment that could block movement. Workers were responsible for clearing these channels, ensuring that goods and people could continue to move efficiently through the city. The design of these canals also required careful consideration. Their width, depth, and direction influenced how water flowed through the city, affecting both movement and stability. Properly managed canals allowed water to circulate in a way that reduced pressure on surrounding structures, while poorly maintained ones could contribute to instability. Bridges and walkways connected different parts of the city, allowing movement between areas that were separated by water. These structures had to be built with materials and designs that could withstand both moisture and shifting ground. Their presence highlights the need to integrate land-based movement into a system that was primarily oriented around water. Drainage was another important aspect of the city's infrastructure. Excess water needed to be managed to prevent flooding and to maintain the stability of the ground. Channels and pathways were designed to direct water away from key areas, reducing the impact of rising levels and helping to maintain the balance between land and water. The maintenance of infrastructure required ongoing effort. Docks, canals, and buildings needed regular attention to remain functional, as environmental conditions could cause gradual wear and change. This maintenance was not a separate activity, but part of the continuous operation of the city, where stability depended on consistent care. The integration of infrastructure into the environment reflects a design approach that prioritized adaptation. Instead of attempting to control the natural conditions completely, the city was built to function within them. This approach allowed Thonis Heracleion to operate effectively despite the challenges of its location. The scale of the city's infrastructure also reflects its importance within the trade network. Large docks, extensive canal systems, and substantial buildings indicate a level of development that supported high volumes of activity. These features demonstrate how the city was structured to handle the demands placed on it as a major port. At the same time, the limitations of the environment remained present. The soft ground, the movement of water, and the accumulation of sediment all influenced how infrastructure could be built and maintained. These factors required constant attention, as small changes could have larger effects over time. The engineering of Thonis Heracleion therefore represents a balance between construction and environment. Each structure was part of a system that needed to function within conditions that could not be fully controlled. This balance allowed the city to operate successfully, while also revealing the constraints that shaped its development. Understanding this infrastructure provides insight into how the city functioned on a practical level. The movement of goods, the stability of buildings, and the management of water all depended on systems that were designed to work together. These systems formed the foundation for the city's role as a major center of trade. Through this perspective, the engineering of Thonis Heracleion can be seen as an ongoing process rather than a fixed achievement. The need for maintenance, adaptation, and coordination reflects the dynamic nature of the environment in which the city existed. This approach allowed the city to function effectively, while also highlighting the challenges that would later influence its stability. The remains of these structures beneath the water continue to reflect this balance. Docks, canals, and foundations can still be observed, providing evidence of how the city was designed to operate within its environment. These features offer insight into the systems that supported daily life and trade, connecting the physical remains to the processes that once defined the city. In this way, the infrastructure of Thonis Heracleion represents both its strength and its vulnerability. The systems that allowed it to function were closely tied to the environment, meaning that changes in those conditions would have a direct impact on its stability. This connection between engineering and environment forms an important part of understanding how the city developed and how it eventually changed over time. As Thonis Heracleion reached its peak as a center of trade and activity, the same environmental conditions that supported its growth began to place increasing pressure on its stability. The city existed within the Nile Delta, a landscape formed from layers of sediment that were constantly influenced by water movement. While this environment allowed for connection and expansion, it also created conditions where the ground beneath the city remained sensitive to change. The sediment that formed the foundation of the city was composed of fine particles carried by the Nile over long periods. These layers created a surface that could support structures under stable conditions, but their composition made them vulnerable to shifts in water content and pressure. The presence of groundwater within these layers meant that the soil was never completely solid, but instead existed in a state that depended on balance. As the city expanded and structures became larger and heavier, the pressure placed on this ground increased. Buildings, temples, and infrastructure added weight that needed to be supported by soil that was already influenced by water saturation. This gradual increase in load did not cause immediate failure, but contributed to a slow change in how the ground responded beneath the city. Water played a central role in this process. The relationship between fresh water from the Nile and salt water from the Mediterranean created conditions where moisture levels within the soil could fluctuate. Seasonal flooding added further variation, increasing water saturation during certain periods and affecting the stability of the ground. These changes were part of a continuous cycle that influenced the environment over time. The movement of sediment also contributed to instability. Currents within the delta carried particles that could accumulate or shift, altering the structure of the ground. This movement was not always visible at the surface, but it affected the underlying layers that supported the city. Over time, these small changes could accumulate, creating areas where stability was reduced. The proximity of the city to sea level introduced additional challenges. Rising water levels, even if gradual, could affect the balance between land and water. Changes in the coastline could alter how water interacted with the delta, influencing both the distribution of sediment and the saturation of the ground. These shifts added to the pressures already present within the environment. Early signs of instability may have appeared as subtle changes within the city. Structures could experience slight settling, where parts of buildings shifted or adjusted under pressure. These changes might not have been immediately noticeable, but they indicated that the ground was responding to the combined effects of weight and moisture. Cracks or misalignments in structures could also develop as the ground beneath them changed. These signs would reflect uneven movement, where some areas remained stable while others shifted more noticeably. The presence of such changes would have required attention, as they could affect the long-term integrity of buildings and infrastructure. The canals and waterways that supported the city's function also played a role in this process. While they allowed for movement and connection, they also introduced continuous interaction between water and soil. The edges of canals could experience erosion, while the flow of water could influence how sediment was distributed. These effects contributed to the overall dynamics of the environment. The balance between land and water was therefore not fixed, but constantly adjusting. Each element of the environment, including water levels, sediment movement, and structural load, interacted with the others in ways that influenced stability. This complexity made it difficult to predict how changes would develop over time. Human activity within the city added to these pressures. The expansion of infrastructure, the maintenance of canals, and the constant movement of goods all influenced how the environment responded. While these activities were necessary for the functioning of the city, they also contributed to the gradual changes occurring beneath the surface. The accumulation of these factors created conditions where the stability of the ground became increasingly uncertain. The environment that once supported the growth of Thonis Heracleion began to show signs of strain, as the balance between water, sediment, and structure shifted over time. These changes were not the result of a single event, but of multiple processes acting together. Understanding this stage of environmental pressure provides insight into how the city moved from stability toward instability. The relationship between natural processes and human activity created a situation where small changes could lead to larger effects. This progression reflects the complexity of the environment and the challenges of maintaining a city within it. The conditions within the Nile Delta continue to demonstrate how such processes operate. Observing these patterns in the present helps to explain how similar changes may have affected Thonis Heracleion in the past. The gradual nature of these processes highlights how instability can develop over time without immediate or dramatic signs. Through this perspective, the early stages of instability can be seen as part of a continuous process rather than a sudden shift. The pressure placed on the environment increased gradually, influenced by both natural forces and the demands of the city. These conditions set the stage for the more significant changes that would follow. The remains of the city beneath the water reflect this process, showing how structures responded to the changing environment. The patterns observed today provide evidence of a system that moved from balance toward instability, shaped by the interaction between land, water, and human activity. This stage represents a critical point in understanding how the city began to transform. As environmental pressure increased beneath Thonis Heracleion, the condition of the ground began to change in a more critical way. The sediment that supported the city was not a solid mass, but a mixture of fine particles and water that depended on balance to remain stable. When this balance shifted, the ground could behave differently, losing its ability to support weight in the way it once had. This change marked a turning point, where gradual instability began to develop into structural weakness. The soil beneath the city was highly saturated due to the constant presence of groundwater within the Nile Delta. This saturation meant that the particles making up the ground were held together not only by contact, but also by the pressure of the water between them. Under stable conditions, this structure allowed the soil to act as a firm base for buildings and infrastructure. When disturbed, however, this balance could break down. One of the key processes involved in this change is known as soil liquefaction. This occurs when waterlogged sediment is subjected to pressure or disturbance, causing it to lose strength and behave more like a liquid than a solid. In such a state, the ground can no longer support heavy structures effectively, leading to movement, sinking, or collapse. This change does not happen instantly in all cases, but can develop as conditions gradually reach a critical point. In the case of Thonis Heracleion, several factors contributed to the conditions that made liquefaction possible. The continuous presence of water within the soil meant that it was already close to a state where cohesion could be lost. The weight of buildings, particularly large stone structures such as temples and statues, added pressure that increased stress within the ground. Over time, this combination created a situation where the stability of the soil was reduced. External forces also played a role in triggering changes within the ground. Natural events such as flooding, shifts in water levels, or even the movement of sediment could disturb the balance of the soil. These disturbances did not need to be dramatic to have an effect, as the environment was already sensitive to change. Small shifts could contribute to a gradual weakening of the ground structure. As the soil began to lose its strength, early signs of structural weakening would have appeared within the city. Buildings may have started to settle unevenly, with some sections sinking slightly, while others remained more stable. This uneven movement could lead to misalignment in walls and foundations, creating visible signs of change within the built environment. The impact of this process would not have been uniform across the city. Different areas experienced varying levels of pressure, water saturation, and sediment composition, leading to differences in how the ground responded. Some sections may have remained relatively stable for longer periods, while others began to weaken more quickly. This uneven response added complexity to the overall condition of the city. Infrastructure connected to waterways was particularly affected by these changes. The edges of canals and docks were in constant contact with water, making them more vulnerable to shifts in sediment. As the ground beneath these structures weakened, the stability of the areas they supported could be compromised, affecting the movement of goods and people within the city. The relationship between water and soil created a feedback effect, where changes in one influenced the other. As the ground weakened, it allowed more water to move through the sediment, further reducing cohesion. This change could accelerate the loss of stability, turning gradual changes into more noticeable movement over time. Heavy structures played a significant role in this process. The weight of temples, statues, and large buildings concentrated pressure on specific areas, increasing the likelihood of soil failure beneath them. As the ground shifted, these structures could begin to tilt or sink, reflecting the changes occurring below the surface. The weakening of the ground also affected the integrity of the city's infrastructure. Canals could become misaligned, docks could lose stability, and pathways could shift as the underlying sediment changed. These effects would have influenced how the city functioned, as movement and organization depended on stable connections between different areas. Despite these changes, the process remained part of a gradual transition rather than an immediate collapse. The city did not disappear at the first sign of instability, but continued to exist as conditions evolved. This period represents a phase where the balance between stability and instability was shifting, moving toward a point where the ground could no longer support the structures above it. Understanding soil liquefaction provides insight into how environmental conditions can influence the stability of a settlement. The relationship between water, sediment, and pressure creates a system where change can occur beneath the surface without immediate visibility. This hidden process can lead to significant effects over time, particularly in environments such as the Nile Delta. The conditions observed at Thonis Heracleion illustrate how this process can develop within a complex environment. The combination of saturated soil, structural weight, and external disturbances created a situation where the ground gradually lost its ability to support the city. This loss of strength set the stage for more dramatic changes that would follow. Through this perspective, the weakening of the ground can be seen as a transition from stability toward failure. The processes involved were part of the natural behavior of the environment, influenced by both the presence of water and the demands placed on the land. This stage represents a critical point in the transformation of the city, where the conditions necessary for collapse began to take shape. As the stability of the ground beneath Thonis Heracleion continued to weaken, the conditions that had been developing over time reached a point where they could no longer be sustained. The balance between weight, water, and sediment began to fail, and the changes that had once been gradual started to become more pronounced. This stage marks the beginning of the city's collapse, where the effects of instability moved from subtle shifts to visible transformation. The process did not begin as a single dramatic event, but as a series of changes that built upon one another. Areas of the city that had already experienced slight settling became more unstable, with the ground beneath them losing its ability to support structures. Buildings that had once stood firmly began to shift more noticeably, creating movement that affected both their alignment and their integrity. In some sections, the ground began to give way under pressure, causing parts of structures to sink unevenly. Walls could tilt as their foundations shifted, and surfaces that had once been level became uneven. These changes would have altered how people moved through the city, as pathways and spaces adjusted to the changing ground beneath them. The effects of this movement extended beyond individual buildings. As one area shifted, it influenced the stability of surrounding sections, creating a chain reaction where changes in one location contributed to instability in another. This interconnected response reflects the way the city was built upon a continuous layer of sediment, where movement was not isolated, but shared across the environment. Water played a central role in this stage of collapse. As the ground weakened, it allowed water to move more freely through the sediment, further reducing its ability to hold shape. This increased flow contributed to the breakdown of cohesion within the soil, accelerating the process of sinking and shifting. The presence of water, which had once supported the function of the city, now became a factor in its transformation. Structures located near canals and waterways were particularly affected, as these areas were already exposed to constant interaction between water and soil. The edges of canals could begin to erode more quickly, and docks that had supported ships became less stable. These changes would have disrupted the systems that allowed the city to function as a port, affecting both movement and trade. The weight of large structures intensified the effects of this process. Temples, statues, and administrative buildings placed significant pressure on the ground, making them more vulnerable to changes in stability. As the soil beneath them weakened, these structures could begin to sink or tilt, reflecting the shifting conditions below. The collapse likely occurred in stages, with different areas of the city responding at different times. Some sections may have experienced gradual sinking, while others underwent more sudden changes. This variation would have created a landscape where stability and instability existed side by side, with certain areas remaining usable, while others became increasingly difficult to navigate. The disruption of infrastructure added to the complexity of this stage. Canals that once provided smooth routes for movement could become misaligned, while pathways between areas were affected by shifting ground. These changes would have influenced how goods and people moved through the city, altering the patterns of daily life. As the process continued, the visible signs of collapse became more apparent. Structures that had shifted slightly began to show more significant changes, and areas that had once been stable could no longer support their original function. The accumulation of these effects marked a transition from a functioning city to one that was increasingly unstable. The relationship between different elements of the environment contributed to the progression of collapse. Water movement, sediment redistribution, and structural load all influenced one another, creating a system where change could accelerate once it began. This interaction reflects the complexity of the conditions that shaped the city's transformation. Despite these changes, the collapse was not necessarily experienced as a single moment, but as a period of adjustment where conditions worsened over time. The city continued to exist during this stage, even as its stability declined. This gradual progression highlights how environmental processes can lead to significant change without immediate or uniform impact. Understanding the beginning of the collapse provides insight into how the city moved from stability towards submersion. The weakening of the ground, the movement of water, and the response of structures all contributed to a process that altered the landscape of Thonis Heracleion. Each element played a role in shaping the conditions that would lead to further transformation. The patterns observed in the remains of the city support this understanding. Structures found beneath the water show signs of movement and displacement, reflecting the changes that occurred during this stage. These features provide evidence of a process that unfolded over time, rather than a single sudden event. Through this perspective, the collapse of Thonis Heracleion can be seen as the result of interacting forces rather than isolated causes. The combination of environmental pressure and structural response created a sequence of changes that gradually altered the city. This stage represents the point where those changes became visible, marking the beginning of the city's transformation into the underwater site that exists today. As the processes weakening the ground beneath Thonis Heracleion continued to build, conditions eventually reached a point where change accelerated. The gradual shifts that had affected parts of the city gave way to more rapid movement, where sections of land could no longer support the structures above them. This stage represents the point at which instability moved beyond adjustment and into structural failure, altering the city in ways that could not be reversed. The sediment beneath the city, already weakened by water saturation and pressure, began to lose cohesion more completely. In areas where this loss was greatest, the ground could no longer hold its form, allowing sections of land to sink more noticeably. This movement did not occur evenly, but varied across the city, creating differences in how structures responded to the changing conditions. Buildings that had previously shifted slightly began to experience more significant displacement. Foundations lost their stability, causing walls to tilt further and structures to settle into the ground. In some cases, the weight of these buildings contributed to their own failure, as the pressure they exerted exceeded what the weakened soil could support. Large stone elements such as statues and temple structures were particularly affected during this phase. Their mass concentrated pressure on the ground beneath them, making them more vulnerable to sudden changes in stability. As the soil gave way, these heavy objects could sink or fall, coming to rest in positions that reflect the direction and nature of the movement. The relationship between water and sediment intensified during this stage. As the ground shifted, it created pathways for water to move more freely through the soil, further reducing cohesion. This increased movement of water contributed to a cycle where instability led to greater saturation, which in turn accelerated the loss of structural support. Canals and waterways, which had once provided organized routes through the city, became part of this process of change. The edges of these channels could collapse or widen as the surrounding ground weakened, altering their shape and affecting how water flowed through the city. These changes disrupted the systems that had supported movement and trade. The failure of infrastructure affected multiple aspects of the city at once. Docks lost their ability to support ships, pathways became uneven or inaccessible, and connections between different areas were disrupted. This breakdown reflects how interconnected the city's systems were, where changes in one element influence the stability of others. The progression of collapse likely involved a series of events where one failure contributed to another. As certain areas sank or shifted, they placed additional stress on surrounding sections, increasing the likelihood of further movement. This chain reaction created a pattern where instability spread through the city over time. Despite the intensity of this phase, the process still unfolded within the broader context of environmental change. The collapse was not caused by a single force, but by the interaction of multiple factors that had been developing over time. The rapid nature of this stage reflects the point at which these factors combined to produce more visible and immediate effects. The presence of water continued to shape how the collapse occurred. As land sank, it allowed water to cover areas that had previously been above the surface, altering the balance between land and sea. This shift contributed to the transformation of the city from a coastal settlement into a partially submerged environment. The response of structures during this stage provides insight into how the collapse unfolded. Some buildings remained partially intact as they sank, preserving their shape even as their position changed. Others experienced more significant damage, breaking apart as the ground beneath them shifted unevenly. These differences reflect the varying conditions across the city. The impact of this rapid collapse would have been visible within the landscape, where the arrangement of structures and the shape of the ground changed noticeably. Areas that had once been stable became unstable, while others transitioned from land to water. These changes marked a clear shift in the condition of the city. Understanding this phase of structural failure highlights how environmental processes can reach a point where change accelerates. The gradual weakening of the ground created conditions where stability could no longer be maintained, leading to a stage where movement became more pronounced and widespread. The patterns observed in the remains of Thonis Heracleion reflect this process. Large objects resting on the seabed, tilted structures, and displaced elements all provide evidence of a stage where the ground lost its ability to support the city. These features help to reconstruct how the collapse may have occurred. Through this perspective, the rapid collapse of Thonis Heracleion can be seen as the result of accumulated pressure reaching a critical point. The relationship between water, sediment, and structural load created conditions where failure became unavoidable, transforming the city in a relatively short period. This stage represents a key moment in the transformation of the city, where the systems that once supported its function gave way to forces that reshaped the landscape. The effects of this collapse would continue to develop, leading to the further submersion of the city beneath the water. As the structural failure of Thonis Heracleion progressed, the boundary between land and water began to shift in a more permanent way. Areas that had once supported buildings and activity gradually lowered, allowing water to move into spaces that had previously remained above the surface. This stage marks the transition from collapse to submergence, where the city began to take on the characteristics of an underwater environment. The process of submergence was not defined by a single moment, but by a continuation of the changes that had already begun. As the ground sank and shifted, water flowed into these newly formed depressions, filling spaces that had once been part of the city's landscape. Over time, these areas became more consistently submerged, altering the overall structure of the settlement. The relationship between water and sediment continued to play a central role. As land lowered, currents carried sand and other particles into the affected areas, gradually covering structures and filling gaps created by collapse. This movement of sediment contributed to the preservation of the city as layers of material settled over buildings and artifacts, protecting them from further disturbance. Buildings that had remained partially intact during the collapse phase became submerged as water levels rose around them. Walls, foundations, and larger structures settled into their new positions beneath the surface, maintaining aspects of their original form while adapting to the surrounding environment. This preservation reflects the gradual nature of the transition from land to water. Canals that had once defined movement within the city became part of a broader network of submerged pathways. The distinction between constructed waterways and natural channels became less clear as water filled the spaces between structures. This transformation altered how the layout of the city would later be observed, blending its original design with the effects of submergence. The presence of water introduced new conditions that influenced the stability of remaining structures. While some elements became more stable once submerged, others continued to shift as sediment settled around them. This interaction created a landscape where stability was relative, depending on the balance between water movement and sediment accumulation. The gradual covering of the city by sediment played an important role in its long-term preservation. Layers of sand and silt settled over structures, reducing exposure to currents and protecting surfaces from erosion. This change allowed many features of the city to remain intact beneath the seabed, preserving details that might otherwise have been lost. The transformation of Thonis Heracleion into an underwater site reflects a continuation of the processes that had shaped its development. The same interaction between water and land that had supported the city now contributed to its submergence. This connection highlights the role of environment in both the growth and transformation of the settlement. The shift from a functioning city to a submerged landscape altered the way the site existed within its surroundings. What had once been a center of activity became part of the seabed, integrated into the natural environment of the Nile Delta. This transition represents a change not only in physical structure, but in how the city related to its environment. Over time, the visibility of the city from the surface disappeared. As water covered the remaining structures and sediment accumulated above them, the physical presence of Thonis Heracleion was no longer apparent. This loss of visibility contributed to its disappearance from practical knowledge, as there were no longer clear signs of its location. The environment continued to shape the site even after submergence. Currents moved sediment across the seabed, and marine life began to interact with the structures, adding new layers to the landscape. These changes were part of an ongoing process, where the city became increasingly integrated into its underwater setting. The preservation of the site beneath the water provides a unique perspective on its final state. Unlike locations that have been rebuilt or altered, Thonis Heracleion remained largely undisturbed once submerged. This condition allows for observation of structures in positions that reflect their response to collapse and submergence. Understanding this stage of transformation provides insight into how the city moved from instability to a new form of equilibrium. The processes that caused its collapse also contributed to its preservation, creating a balance between change and stability beneath the water. The patterns observed in the remains of the city reflect this transition. Structures are found resting within layers of sediment, with their positions indicating the direction and nature of the changes that occurred. These patterns provide evidence of how the city became part of the seabed. Through this perspective, the submergence of Thonis Heracleion can be understood as the result of continuous interaction between water, sediment, and structure. The city did not disappear suddenly, but transformed gradually into an underwater landscape, shaped by the same forces that once supported it. This stage represents the completion of the physical transformation of the city, where land became part of the sea and structures settled into their final positions. The environment that once allowed the city to thrive now defined its existence beneath the surface, creating the conditions that preserved it for future discovery. As Thonis Heracleion settled beneath the water and became part of the seabed, its presence gradually disappeared from the visible world. The structures that had once defined the city were no longer accessible, and the pathways that connected it to surrounding regions were replaced by open water and shifting sediment. This stage marks the transition from a known location to a forgotten one, where the city's existence moved from physical reality into memory and record. Without visible remains above the surface, the practical knowledge of the city's location began to fade. Travelers navigating the Nile Delta no longer encountered its docks or waterways, and the routes that had once led to its port adjusted to the changing landscape. Over time, the absence of physical markers made it increasingly difficult to identify where the city had once stood. Written accounts became the primary source of information about Thonis Heracleion. Ancient Egyptian and Greek texts continued to reference the city, describing its role as a gateway into Egypt and its importance within trade networks. These accounts preserved aspects of its identity, but lacked the precise geographic detail needed to locate it within the shifting environment of the delta. The difference in naming between Egyptian and Greek sources added to the uncertainty surrounding the city. Referred to as Thonis in Egyptian texts and Heracleion in Greek accounts, the connection between these names was not always clearly understood. This separation contributed to the difficulty of linking references across different traditions, making it harder to identify the city as a single location. As generations passed, the absence of physical evidence led to increasing doubt about the city's existence. Some scholars questioned whether the accounts described a real place or a combination of stories shaped by trade and cultural exchange. The lack of confirmation allowed uncertainty to grow, turning the city into a subject of debate rather than established knowledge. The changing landscape of the Nile Delta also contributed to this uncertainty. The movement of sediment and the shifting of waterways altered the region over time, making it difficult to compare ancient descriptions with the present environment. Locations that may once have corresponded to written accounts no longer matched visible features, further complicating attempts to identify the city. The process of forgetting was gradual, shaped by the interaction between loss of visibility and the limitations of record keeping. While the city remained present within texts, its absence from the physical landscape reduced its relevance within everyday knowledge. Over time, it became more distant, moving from a known location to a historical reference. The idea of Thonis Heracleion began to take on characteristics associated with legend. The descriptions of a significant port city that had disappeared beneath the sea created a narrative that was difficult to confirm, but also difficult to dismiss. This combination allowed the city to exist in a space between history and story, where its reality remained uncertain. Despite this uncertainty, the continued presence of references in ancient texts ensured that the memory of the city was not entirely lost. These records preserved details about its role, its location near the Nile Delta, and its connection to trade. Although incomplete, this information provided a foundation for later investigation. The absence of the city from practical experience meant that it was no longer part of navigation, trade, or daily life within the region. The functions that had once defined it were replaced by new routes and settlements as the environment continued to change. This transition reflects how quickly a location can move from central importance to absence when conditions shift. The persistence of written records highlights the difference between physical and recorded knowledge. While the structures of Thonis Heracleion were hidden beneath the water, the information contained in texts allowed the idea of the city to remain present. This distinction would later play a role in guiding efforts to rediscover the site. The forgotten state of the city did not mean that it ceased to exist, but rather that its presence was no longer directly observed. Beneath the water, the structures remained in place, preserved by layers of sediment and protected from the changes occurring above. This hidden existence contrasts with its absence from the visible landscape. Understanding this stage provides insight into how locations can move from prominence to obscurity over time. The loss of visibility, combined with changes in environment and knowledge, created conditions where Thonis Heracleion was no longer recognized as a physical place. Instead, it existed within records that could not be easily verified. The gradual transformation of the city into a forgotten location reflects the broader processes that affect historical sites. Environmental change, shifting landscapes, and limitations in documentation all contribute to how places are remembered or lost. In the case of Thonis Heracleion, these factors combined to create a period where its existence remained uncertain. Through this perspective, the loss of the city to history can be seen as part of its overall transformation. The same processes that led to its submergence also influenced how it was remembered, shaping its presence within both physical and recorded forms. This stage represents a transition where the city became part of the past, waiting to be understood again. The continued existence of references to Thonis Heracleion ensured that it remained within the scope of historical inquiry. Although its location was unknown, the information preserved in texts allowed for the possibility that it could one day be rediscovered. This connection between record and reality would later become significant as new methods of investigation were developed. The rediscovery of Thonis Heracleion marked a significant shift in how the city was understood, moving it from uncertain record into confirmed reality. For centuries, references to the city existed within ancient texts, but without physical evidence, its location remained unknown. Advances in technology and methods of investigation made it possible to explore areas beneath the waters of the Nile Delta, where the remains of the city had been preserved. The search for the city focused on regions where ancient descriptions suggested it might have been located. These descriptions pointed to an area near the mouth of the Nile, where trade routes from the Mediterranean would have entered Egypt. Identifying this region required careful analysis of historical records, combined with an understanding of how the landscape of the delta had changed over time. Modern exploration techniques played a central role in locating the site. Equipment capable of detecting structures beneath the seabed allowed researchers to identify patterns that suggested the presence of human-made features. These patterns indicated the outlines of buildings, canals, and other elements that were consistent with the descriptions of Thonis Heracleion. Once the site was identified, underwater archaeology provided a way to examine the remains in detail. Divers and specialized teams worked to uncover structures that had been buried beneath layers of sediment. This change required careful removal of sand and silt to reveal features without disturbing their position, preserving the arrangement of the site as it had settled over time. The discoveries made at the site confirmed that the city described in ancient texts had once existed as a major port. Large stone statues, temple structures, and remains of buildings were found beneath the water, providing clear evidence of a complex settlement. The scale of these findings demonstrated the importance of the city within ancient Egypt. Artifacts recovered from the site offered insight into daily life, trade, and religious practices. Objects such as tools, containers, and decorative items reflected the activity that had taken place within the city. These artifacts were often found in positions that suggested how they had been used, providing a connection between the physical remains and the routines of the past. The condition of the site revealed how the city had been preserved. Many structures remained in positions that reflected their response to collapse and submergence, rather than being scattered or destroyed. This preservation allowed researchers to study the layout of the city and understand how its different parts were connected. Ships found at the site provided additional evidence of the city's role as a port. These vessels, resting on the seabed, indicated the presence of active trade and movement within the area. Their condition and placement offered insight into how the port functioned and how ships were integrated into its systems. The rediscovery also clarified the connection between the names Thonis and Heracleion. Evidence from the site confirmed that these names referred to the same location, resolving a long-standing uncertainty within historical studies. This connection allowed information from Egyptian and Greek sources to be understood as part of a single narrative. The process of excavation required careful planning to ensure that the site remained protected. Removing sediment and exposing structures needed to be balanced with the need to preserve the conditions that had allowed the city to remain intact. This approach ensured that the site could be studied without causing damage to its features. The findings at Thonis Heracleion contributed to a broader understanding of ancient trade networks and coastal settlements. The combination of artifacts, structures, and environmental context provided a detailed view of how the city functioned within its setting. This information added to knowledge about the interaction between environment and human activity in the Nile Delta. The rediscovery also demonstrated the value of combining historical records with modern technology. Ancient texts provided clues about the location and importance of the city, while contemporary methods allowed those clues to be tested and confirmed. This connection highlights how knowledge from different periods can be brought together to reveal new understanding. The presence of the city beneath the water provided a unique opportunity for study. Unlike sites that have been altered by continued occupation or rebuilding, Thonis Heracleion remained largely undisturbed after its submergence. This condition allowed researchers to observe structures and artifacts in contexts that reflect their original use. Understanding the process of rediscovery provides insight into how knowledge of the past can be recovered. The combination of investigation, technology, and careful excavation allowed the city to be identified and studied in a way that would not have been possible in earlier periods. This change reflects the ongoing development of methods for exploring historical sites. The rediscovery of Thonis Heracleion transformed it from a subject of uncertainty into a confirmed location with a clear physical presence. The remains beneath the water provided evidence that supported and expanded upon historical accounts, connecting record with reality. This stage represents a return of the city into awareness, where it could once again be understood within its historical context. Through this perspective, the rediscovery of the city can be seen as a continuation of its story, where the processes that led to its preservation also made it possible for it to be found. The relationship between past and present allowed the hidden remains of Thonis Heracleion to be revealed, providing insight into a city that had long been out of view. The story of Thonis Heracleion reflects a complete cycle, where a city formed through opportunity, developed through adaptation, and changed through the same forces that once supported it. Its location within the Nile Delta provided access to trade and connection, allowing it to grow into a place of importance within ancient Egypt. At the same time, that location introduced conditions that required constant balance, where land and water interacted in ways that shaped both stability and change. The development of the city shows how human systems can be built within complex environments. Trade networks, infrastructure, and daily life were all organized in ways that allowed the city to function effectively despite the challenges of its setting. This organization reflects an understanding of how to work within natural conditions rather than attempt to control them completely. The gradual shift from stability to instability highlights the role of long-term processes in shaping outcomes. Changes in water levels, sediment movement, and structural load occurred over time, creating conditions that were not immediately visible but became significant as they accumulated. This progression demonstrates how environments can change in ways that affect human settlements without clear warning. The collapse of the city illustrates how interconnected systems respond to change. The relationship between ground, water, and structure created a situation where movement in one area influenced others, leading to a chain of effects that altered the entire landscape. This change reflects the complexity of the environment in which the city existed. The transition from collapse to submergence shows how the same forces that cause change can also contribute to preservation. As structures sank and water filled the spaces between them, layers of sediment settled over the city, protecting it from further disturbance. This balance between transformation and preservation allowed the city to remain intact beneath the water. The period in which the city was lost to history highlights how knowledge can change over time. Without visible remains, Thonis Heracleion moved from being a known location to a subject of uncertainty, where its existence was questioned despite references in historical records. This stage reflects the limits of observation and the importance of evidence in shaping understanding. The rediscovery of the city demonstrates how advances in knowledge and technology can reveal what was once hidden. By combining information from ancient texts with modern methods of exploration, it became possible to locate and study the remains of the city beneath the water. This change connected past records with present understanding, allowing the story of Thonis Heracleion to be reconstructed. Looking at the remains of the city today provides a view into a moment where change occurred and then settled into stillness. Structures, artifacts, and patterns within the seabed reflect the processes that shaped the city, preserving details that allow for careful observation. This condition offers insight into both the life of the city and the changes that led to its transformation. The environment of the Nile Delta continues to demonstrate the same processes that influenced the city in the past. Water movement, sediment deposition, and shifting ground remain part of the region, showing how similar conditions can exist across long periods. Observing these processes helps to explain how the city developed and how it changed over time. Through this perspective, Thonis Heracleion can be understood as part of a broader pattern where human activity and natural forces interact continuously. The city was not separate from its environment, but shaped by it at every stage of its existence. This connection defines both its success and its transformation. The story also reflects the relationship between visibility and understanding. When the city existed above the surface, it was part of trade routes and daily life, clearly present within the landscape. Once submerged, it became hidden, existing only within records and memory until it was rediscovered. This change shows how perception influences what is known and what is uncertain. The preservation of the city beneath the water provides a rare opportunity to study a site that has not been altered by continued occupation or rebuilding. This condition allows for a clearer view of how structures were arranged and how they responded to change. The ability to observe these details contributes to a deeper understanding of the past. The combination of development, collapse, and rediscovery creates a narrative that connects different stages of time. Each stage builds upon the previous one, forming a sequence that reflects both continuity and transformation. This sequence provides a framework for understanding how the city existed and how it became part of the underwater landscape. Through this understanding, the city is no longer seen only as a lost place, but as an example of how environments and human systems interact. The processes that shaped Thonis Heracleion continue to operate in other settings, making its story relevant beyond its specific location. The remains beneath the water continue to offer insight into this interaction, providing evidence that can be studied and interpreted. Each structure and artifact contributes to a larger picture, where the details of the city's life and transformation are preserved within the seabed. The story of Thonis Heracleion therefore reflects both change and continuity, showing how a city can move through different stages while remaining connected to the environment that shaped it. This connection forms the foundation for understanding its place within history. Thank you for listening to the Sleepy Mind channel. I hope you enjoyed learning about the lost Egyptian city of Thonis Heracleion.